Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review the movie The Mighty Ducks. So, when honestly going into this movie, I'm just kind of happy and or delighted that this movie is a Minnesota film, because recently there are very few times here and there when I'm watching a movie, then all of a sudden I'll find out the actual setting was Minnesota. Like the movie Joe Somebody with Tim Allen, that movie was done supposedly in Minnesota, or the setting was. We ultimately have it to where there's some kind of mixture of some movies every once in a while that you'll find out was actually done in Minnesota. So that's kind of interesting. So going into this movie, I think that this movie really is to showcase Emilio Estevez's character heavily, like as if like they're really trying to sell you on the fact that this is like Emilio Estevez's movie, and hilariously enough, like the kids are just kind of like, well, a means to an end kind of thing. We have it to where these kids are here, but they're not really the focus of this story. It's heavily, I think, about Estevez's like kind of story arc or his journey through this film, and eventually when we get into sequels, it seems like Emilio takes a back seat for other people in this movie. Case in point, we have Joshua Jackson that ultimately is in this film. Knowing him from movies like Urban Legends, or ultimately being in Dawson's Creek, or also being in any number of stretch of other things, as well as like the movie Cursed, and so on and so forth. We ultimately have uh, Eldon Henson, who ultimately plays Fulton in this movie, which ultimately I'm like, hey, he was in the show Daredevil. Like, yeah, like it's kind of, and also I had seen him in the movie Butterfly Effect with Ashton Kutcher. Ultimately, kind of like going through this cast of characters, at some point you can just kind of point out and just be like, hey, yeah, I remember that guy from so and so film, or hey, I remember that from so and so film. I think when we get into the later characters, the later kind of movies, like it seems like there's even much more notable characters that go on to have more prominent roles in other things. But ultimately, again, the showcasing of this movie is really just heavily Emilio Estevez, and the actual Mighty Ducks part of it is just kind of like an afterthought, I think, which is kind of weird. Uh, but again, in the sequels, we kind of take a back seat to have Emilio Estevez just kind of being there, and we're pushing more of the story much more heavily on Joshua Jackson's character, because he seems to be the real standout. Or it seems that also, like, especially in the third one, we get more of Joshua Jackson's kind of journey, whereas in the second one, we have it to where he is like, he's prominently like he's the captain and everyone's getting behind him, and we have it to where like you got to add some quite a few folks into the sequel movie, because we have Team USA that eventually changes into being renamed the Mighty Ducks, and so on and so forth. Like the sequel kind of goes on to us meeting new characters, because ultimately they kind of take the lazy way out a little bit in the sequel. But I do like that the sequel kind of infuses a lot more comedy. It seems like there's a lot of interesting things going on in the sequel compared to the original one. Uh, like they do a lot of interesting things within the other movies, especially the third one. I kind of like the kind of journey where it's kind of like Joshua Jackson in the third movie is kind of going through like a "This Is Your Life" kind of moment, or a "It's a Wonderful Life" kind of moment, where we end up having Joshua Jackson ending up kind of really being told, like, dude, you're messing up. And Emilio Estevez is going to come in and tell you why you're messing up. And so, anyways, um, going into this first movie, we have it to where, I don't know, it kind of honestly feels like a lot of things feel very natural, or kind of, I don't know, like, I kind of want to back and forth say that everything that is going on in this movie feels natural, and sometimes it doesn't feel natural. It kind of feels like the delivery of a lot of stuff is just kind of bizarre at some points, or just kind of feels like throughout a lot of this movie, it kind of feels like there is stuff that feels like it's delivered as lines, as rather like somebody like taking something and really making it their own. When going in here, I feel like this is like somewhere of a crux of like looking back on it. Like it feels kind of like a Lifetime movie or something, where we have to have it to where, uh, like Emilio Estevez's character is kind of a guy that is seemingly, uh, really had had one moment in his life just kind of uh, have him just what would be the metaphorical word? We had it to where this guy is becoming a snowball that is coming down a hill. We end up having it to where this guy, from one moment of time when he was younger, just had this snowball just accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, rolling down this hill forever, and eventually knocking people down along his way. But so we end up having a tour seemingly, Gerard Ducksworth, which is ultimately Emilio Estevez's boss, is ultimately telling him, like, hey, you know what? How about you take some time off? How about you just go and, like, you need some time away to ultimately just kind of reassess and reassert yourself, um, back onto this planet called Earth. And so we eventually easily have it to where Emilio Estevez changes from who he is to quite easily and simply eventually like realizing that he needs to get his groove back. And then when eventually he does get his groove back, we end up having it to where like this is kind of like the formula that we have to go with in these movies, that everybody has to bizarrely like get their groove back, and they have to just go and skate around on the ice to ultimately get their uh get their like, yeah, I gotta be me again, I gotta find me, I gotta remember the me again. Like I think Emilio Estevez like goes through that like two times in two of these movies. So it kind of, but ultimately you just love the journeys of the sequels. You just love the approach. And eventually we have it to where eventually Joshua Jackson goes into that journey of like him needing to dust off the skates and ultimately find himself again. So ultimately, that is all that I really wanted to say in a very, I wouldn't, I guess I would say it's almost spoiler territory, but I'm kind of, uh, I think people have seen this movie or heard about it. It's on Disney Plus right now. If you didn't know it was on there, I believe ultimately they are going into doing some kind of Mighty Ducks reboot or sequel or something. At some point, I've heard some rumblings that Emilio Estevez is seemingly going to be part of whatever the heck that is. So I guess we can be excited about that. But yeah, I just decided to just like watch this first one and see where this goes. Ultimately, people might not care about this review, and I'll just move on and probably watch the other sequel movies, or maybe not. Because when looking at them, I think I like the second one, but the third one, I'm like, it's a little rough. The third one's a little rough. But anyways, so let's go into spoilers about this first movie. I would say reasonably my real true consensus about this film is it's fun. Really, I think there's some kind of disconnect when we actually get to the actual hockey parts a lot of the times. And I think a lot of the approaches that especially go into this hockey thing is just kind of a lot of gimmicks, bizarrely. Like, I think there's a lot of, like, and I guess that's for a lot of sports movies. There always has to be this, like, bizarre gimmick that has to go into a lot of their athletes, which I thought that that was strange and utterly bizarre, where you'd have to have, like, this one key person that has this, like, slap shot thing that ultimately is just killing people or whatever, or not killing people because this is a Disney movie. But ultimately, it's just kind of really very powerful, or really just okay. So let's move on. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. One thing that I have to say, Fulton in this movie, big thumbs up. Oh my god. Like, when I saw Fulton in this movie, I'm like, he's a big, tall guy that ultimately doesn't know how to skate. I don't know how to skate. I'm not going to even try to even go out of my way to learn to skate now because heaven forbid I go and try to learn to skate. I'm not going to do that kind of thing anymore. To go into journeys of probably falling on my batucus and breaking something. I don't know. I feel like I am not going to do that kind of thing anymore. I tried some things. I went into some journeys, and ultimately, I didn't. I fell on my butt while doing it. So I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not gonna go into like roller skating and falling on my butt and breaking a batucus or something. So, anyways, batucus, everybody, batucus. Anyways, so going into this movie, we have it to where we have to kind of really set up like Emilio's character. He gets his own little blurred esh like flashbacky scene where we have young Gordon Bombay ultimately seem like it's a tie game. The We have it to where Gordon is ultimately the last man of the hockey team to ultimately get this score. We ultimately have it to where Gordon ends up doing this triple deke. He ends up trying to get the puck in the net, and it seems that the puck ends up ricocheting off the net or out of the net. Or not out of the net, off the net, and hit ding and frickin' flies out. So we end up finding out that supposedly Gordon's team had lost via overtime, and we have it to where Gordon has really just he has really forcibly taken that moment and kind of just utterly just kind of been at the bottom of the barrel ever since that moment. To the point where eventually we find out that Gordon Bombay is seemingly a very successful lawyer. Ultimately, it seems that he has a 30-1 record. Because ultimately he had said 30-0, but ultimately his assistant is telling him 30-1, and ultimately he's like, yeah, whatever, it happens. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly that we end up having it to where Gordon ends up going into his court and kind of really strong arming this whole case. It seems that Gordon is ultimately just saying, like, oh, well, I think I can win anyways, so I think I can just talk to the judge and just treat him like garbage, and I can treat my other attorney next to me like garbage, and because ultimately I think I have some loophole. I think I have some solving thing. And so we ultimately have it to where reasonably we have it to where Ducksworth, uh, who is uh, who is Bombay's superior, ends up like, hey, how about you come to my office? and we end up having like Gordon think that, oh, I'm going to get a raise, or oh, I'm going to get a promotion, or oh, I'm going to get all numbers of things, and we end up having it to where reasonably Ducksworth is ultimately going and really just, instead of actually like praising Bombay, he ends up kind of ridiculing him, basically mentioning it's like, well, hey, like a W isn't the only thing that matters, kind of thing. It's like you gotta try to treat people well. It's like, come on. So we end up having it to where Gordon ends up taking that kind of blow from his superior to just kind of like tell him it's like, well, hey, like it's not all about winning. And when looking at it, Gordon reminded from his coach that his coach was an awful man that ultimately told him like winning is everything, the only thing that matters, so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where Bombay ends up going and bombing, going and seemingly getting too much alcohol and driving. We end up having it to where reasonably a police officer ends up pulling him over, and then we end up having Bombay going to court because of this. We end up having it to where seemingly again, Bombay is going to be able to fight all this, and really he's going to be his own attorney for this case, and so on and so forth. We end up having it to where reasonably Ducksworth is ultimately just going like, hey, like we end up having it to where Bombay ends up coming in, and Ducksworth is like, well, hey, I heard that you're that you're drunk and disorderly, and this and that, and all these in this cases, and we end up having Bombay going, well, yeah, I think I have a loophole for that. I think I'll be perfectly fine, and so we end up having it to where like Ducksworth is ultimately saying like, you know what? I think that you need to get some fresh air. Like you need to just plead guilty to this whole thing, and you ultimately need to do some community service hours. And I think you just need a suspension, or just you need to just take time off from work. So we end up having it to where seemingly Gordon is now pushed into teaching a Pee Wee Hockey League because he can't do anything else. So we end up having it to where Gordon ends up finding out where these kids are, and they're seemingly just in the middle of nowhere because these kids can't even afford like real legitimate hockey jerseys. It just kind of feels like really their equipment is just newspapers taped to their legs, and like football helmets, uh, and pads that really aren't hockey pads. It's just whatever other sport or whatever it looks quasi good enough to be like a hockey equipment looking thing. Then I guess that ultimately that's what they just put them on in the early stages. And they ultimately, instead of having them being called the Mighty Ducks, they're ending up just being called District 5. So we end up having it to ultimately Gordon is to go and drive this limousine onto the ice, and we end up having it to where the limo driver, who is ultimately Lewis, is like, are you sure about that? And Gordon's like, dude, I know about ice, like I've lived and breathed on the ice, I think I was born on the ice, kind of thing. And so you ultimately have it to where these kids end up going, and we have it to where Gordon is really kind of giving these kids the coach's shtick, kind of to the point to where it's just like, well, like, hey, like, I'm sure that basically all of you people, after experiencing me coach you, uh, are going to be writing about this story in your prison cells, about how wonderful of a coach I was, and how like this will be the greatest part of your life, and this and that. And so We end up having it to where Gordon is telling him like what the schedule is, and so they end up going and they end up hopping onto this limousine and end up like going into this limousine, and we end up having one of the girls shout out, who I think is Connie, ends up shouting out, it's like, "Oh, I feel like Madonna." So we end up having it to where we end up having uh, Charlie's mother end up running off to the ice, ultimately saying, "Oh my God, like this car ultimately would have just ended up just falling through the ice." And we end up having Bombay end up saying, "No, like if anything, I know full well that this ice is so thick, we were perfectly fine." So we seemingly have Casey, who is a very worried mother, and we have basically Gordon's character is ultimately just looking at this woman. It's like, like this is the only woman that I've kind of seen in I don't know however long, so I guess I have to cling myself onto this woman. So we end up finding out that Casey is seemingly Charlie Conway's son. So we end up kind of consistently having it to where Emilio ends up kind of hanging out with Charlie at some points and this and that, or what have you. So we end up having it to where the first match out is to ultimately uh, tie the Hawks with District 5. So we end up finding out that recently these characters stink. We end up having Averson ultimately saying swing better, better. We have it to where Gordon is like, there is no batter, there is no pitcher, this is not baseball. It's like you're doing the wrong sport. So we end up having it to where reasonably uh, so now Averson is ultimately going and like just saying some other hey goalie goalie, hey goalie ho goalie, like just like to the point to where I'm sure like Bombay is just like how about you just go away? How would you just go away? So we end up having it to where ultimately, so District 5 ends up getting creamed uh, from the Hawks. For ultimately, we have it to where ultimately Coach Riley is ultimately just reveling in the fact that he's just cleaning Gordon's clock. Ultimately, as a revenge measure for Gordon blowing that game. So we end up having it to where Coach Riley is just like so excited. He's like, "Yeah, like I couldn't have believed that. Like I had such a good time cleaning your clock with your team, kind of thing." So we end up having it to where Gordon is now starting to realize that it's like, you know what? I need to do something. We end up having it to where eventually Bombay ends up connecting seemingly with his surrogate father, which is Hans, because we end up finding out that Gordon's character had lost his father early in his life and had to take care of his mother, which kind of connects him with Charlie and makes kind of an interesting story. So because everything is about Gordon in this movie, to be brutally honest. So we end up having it to where Bombay is starting to realize is like, you know what? How about I go and start to realize that justifiably, like I'm going to have to do this, uh, like I'm going to have to do this thing anyways. How about I just like fully commit to it? And so we end up having it to ultimately like Gordon eventually talking to Hans, ultimately having it to where Hans is kind of mentoring him and kind of being like, if you want to go with like a home improvement route with Tim Allen, Ultimately remembering that there was Wilson, that was ultimately the guy that was ultimately at the other side of the fence telling Tim Allen what to do. Like, I think that that kind of moment kind of remnants is kind of very reminiscent to Hans and in Bombay ultimately having this talking to where ultimately uh, to where Bombay is otherwise going to realize that it's his time to be able to be legitimately a coach. We end up having it to where ultimately Bombay ends up putting on the skates and ultimately skating around in the hockey rink, just kind of see like if he still has his stuff. So we end up having it to where Bombay is going to his boss and end up saying like, "Hey, how about you guys sponsor my team? We'll call ourselves the Ducks. We'll call ourselves whatever this company is, the Duckworth Company. We'll mention that you have been sponsoring us and so on and so forth, even though there wasn't real any lick of that, really, to be brutally honest. But ultimately, Ducksworth is ultimately just going like, dude, there's no way that I'm going to fund your business. No, I'm going to fund your hockey. But ultimately, we have it to where Emilio is again talking this guy into it. And so ultimately, you have all the kids just buying all this crazy equipment. And so eventually, it seems that we find out that Emilio is actually going to be a true legitimate duck because evidently they had redrawn the district lines. And so eventually we have it uh, to where Bombay ends up pulling Banks, which is seemingly the Hawks' best player, told me come and play with Mighty Ducks. So also, while we are to go on here, we are also to eventually have it to where at this place we end up having it to where when all these kids are buying all this equipment and we seemingly have the funding of being able to go to this ice rink. So we end up having it to where ultimately we have this big bulky guy that ends up coming in that is end up being called Fulton Reed. So we end up having it to where reasonably uh, Bombay ends up asking for this kid, like, hey, who's that? We end up kind of getting told that supposedly this kid quite possibly can't play hockey because ultimately uh, people are worried about him getting injured because ultimately he is really good at another sport evidently, and so ultimately like they don't want him to do a sport like hockey because he can quite possibly get injured. I'm like, this guy is head and shoulders freaking above any freaking person. How is he going to get injured, especially playing hockey? What is he going to get, a blade to the jugular or whatever? Like, come on. Like, I know that's awful for me to say that for a kids movie, but like I'm kind of like come on, like Fulton is a big guy, and ultimately when looking at it, um, not saying like he's a heavy set guy. No, like I'm just saying like he's like heads and toe like taller than everyone else. But then eventually when everybody hits their spurts of sorts, then it kind of evens everything out. So, or either that or reasonably people all stood on stilts. I don't know. So, going into here, I thought it was kind of interesting when Fulton was trying to prevent these hawk guys from um, attacking these duck guys. We end up having Fulton just going, kind of thing. And like, that was the only thing that he needed to do, but it doesn't even sound like him. So we end up having to where eventually Fulton is slap shotting hockey pucks out onto the street, I guess, to ultimately try and hit the pucks into some uh, into some box of sorts. So we end up having it to where Bombay is driving around, and eventually we have it to where the pucks end up hitting his glass window, and we end up having Fulton running off into the night or the street to just get away from Bombay, who is now chasing after him. we end up having it to where Bombay ends up grabbing Fulton. He's like, "Hey man, I'm sorry, it's a window." And so ultimately, Bombay is like, "No, I don't care about the window. Like, I thought that was an amazing shot. It came off like a gunshot. Holy crap!" So we end up having it to where Bombay ends up wanting to see this slap shot again, and we end up having Fulton just like freaking just like flopping it out there. So we end up having it to where we are to know that I guess Fulton, 1 out of 5 shots goes into where he wants it to go, which is the goal. So we end up having it to where reasonably Bombay is seeing this massive, just seemingly like gunfire of a hockey puck, and Bombay's like, yeah, like this is going to be like an intimidation factor. This is going to be like, yeah, like have Fulton basically do this while all the other kids are watching so they can just be frightened by Fulton just lighting this net up. But also we have to get Goldberg, who in this movie like is kind of just really scared about getting hit, because numerous times we have it to where Goldberg is the goalie, and like in the very early District 5 days, we end up having to where Goldberg is basically just like, dude, I'm not even wanting to protect the net, because ultimately I'm consistently not wanting to get hit, because I don't even think he had the right protective gear on anyways. But eventually, when we have it to where Goldberg ends up getting lit up with all these hockey pucks, it seems like eventually he is fine. Eventually, they get some figure skaters to be added into this roster, and it seems like that seems to be a consistent thing that they always need to find like figure skaters to ultimately be a part of this hockey thing, which ultimately like, okay, quite obviously skates and hockey skates are two different things. So I'm not quite sure that you can exactly do the exact same things with both kind of hockey skates and whatever. So when looking at it, I'm a little confused about some of the stuff that they approach in here. But so I really like the fact that ultimately we have Fulton as doing the Statue of Liberty play, where ultimately we have it to where Fulton is the real true intimidation factor to basically have everybody cleaning house from the entire team to run off, and we have it to where Fulton ends up going and is going to take the shot, seemingly, but no, he's just setting it up for some other person to grab it and then drop it right into the goal. And also, we also had an interesting moment where ultimately Fulton could not skate, or could not like roller skate or skate whatsoever. So we have this one portion of time where we have the entire Mighty Ducks ultimately kind of rollerblading their way through the recessed Mall of America. And I thought that that scene was really interesting, where we have like Fulton just kind of like roller skating his way through these flights of stairs, and I thought that that scene was really interesting. But moving on, so ultimately we have it to where seemingly it seems like there is some real dissension within the ranks of this team. It seems that Jesse Hall seems to have a lot of dissension with Bombay, because ultimately when they are early in the stages of the Mighty Ducks, we end up having it to where ultimately Bombay is ultimately just saying like, well, how about instead of we actually just learning the correct way of being a team, how about instead we just cheat to win? And we end up having Jesse Hall's father end up coming in and be like, dude, did I seriously have to come in here to watch my kid take dives and cheat to win? And so we end up having it to where Jesse Hall and his brother kind of end up eventually almost trying to want to leave this team. And especially also when Bombay gets Banks we end up having it to where kind of that rubs Jesse Hall the wrong way, because we end up having Banks, who is kind of like in the middle of two different teams, kind of thing. We ultimately have it to where Jesse ultimately is going to bail out on this team, because we eventually have it to where eventually Bombay is talking to Coach Riley, and we end up having it to where Coach Riley is saying how Bombay's team is like, your team is a disgrace, like your team is a gimmick team, and we end up having Bombay is saying like, yeah, I'm sure we're the worst team that you've ever seen. I'm sure we don't even deserve to live, and blah blah blah. But we have it to where Bombay really finally comes to the real consensus of that Bombay is going to try to be a much better coach than really Coach Riley ever was. And I think that is the real thing that Bombay is going to learn, because we end up having it to where Riley is pushing his team and really just like winning is the only thing that matters, and ultimately we have to where it's like, dude, this is Pee Wee hockey. This is not NHL. These guys are not getting fat checks for all the stuff that they have to do and whatever, what have you. With the exclusion of, hey, these people are paid actors, so I'm sure they're getting some pretty decent checks, maybe. So, for being the time of which that this was. So, we end up having it to where reasonably going into here. So, we end up having it to where I think Peter ultimately and some of the other teams are ultimately realizing that Bombay had said that they had no reason to live, and kind of like mimicking all the stuff that Bombay had said to Riley. But ultimately, we have it to where they didn't hear the whole statement. They just kind of left like halfway through. So we end up having it to where reasonably Bombay is like, you know what? I am not going to be able to ever earn the real true trust of this team. So ultimately, I think I need to leave. But we have it to where seemingly Bombay is kind of making some headway with Casey. It seems that eventually Bombay and Charlie end up kind of really connecting with one another. And it seems a lot of times when the team all leaves, we end up having Charlie and Fulton like showing up to play against this team. And we end up having, at some point, having Bombay have to forfeit a game or two, because ultimately, like, his team doesn't want to play his kind of hockey because they don't trust him. So we end up having it to where eventually Bombay is seemingly winning over Charlie, to the point of Charlie ultimately just saying like, "Hey, like my mom's home," kind of thing. Like, "Hey, do you want to have dinner with us? Do you want to do you want to just kind of like see if my mom has the hots for you," kind of thing. And so eventually, at some point, we end up having it to where Bombay and Casey end up going ice skating together, and we end up having it to where Casey kind of like drops down on Bombay. It's like, well, hey, like, you know what? Like, if me and you don't actually work out, then I think I will be fine. But I think it'll just really affect my son. And so we end up having it to where Bombay is like, well, really? Will it just affect your son? Are you just really not going to give this a good old college try just because, like, you don't want to see where this is going to end up, kind of thing? And so we end up having Bombay and Casey kind of smooch it out, just to ultimately like cement that it's like, I think we're good for one another, and let's see where this goes, kind of thing. So because we end up having it to where Bombay ends up going and getting the Mighty Ducks jerseys, and ultimately telling everybody like, hey, I'm a duck. Like, hey, let's all quack, quack, quack. because we end up having it to where recently Bombay's jokingly thing from his boss was told to me, quack, 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 Mr. Ducksworth. Because recently we had it to where, like, that was the joke that he always had for his boss. And so ultimately taking that joke and turning it into now, like, this is what the team has for a cheer. And now every single time before they go out on the field, let's just say, or out in the ring, we end up having a tour they have to quack consistently, which I thought was interesting and or hilarious. And then everybody just started to get together on it. But then eventually when we have it in the sequels, it just kind of eventually just fizzles out to where it's ultimately just kind of done as a joke to have like somebody go in and say like, yeah, we're gonna quack, right? And ultimately they're like, no, we're not gonna do that crap. Like that was Bombay's era. Like, you're not Mighty Ducks anymore. You're whatever the heck this is. So we end up having it to where reasonably. So we have it to where it seems that the team is winning. Things are happening. Fulton is lighting people up with his slap shots, which I don't even know is a thing they can even do in hockey anymore. I don't know if they slap shot anymore. I don't know what the rules are in certain things or whatever. So going into this movie, we end up having it to where reasonably there is some kind of approaches, there's some kind of special moves that they're doing, but really when looking at it, like I think the best thing is eventually when in the very first kind of later end of this movie, we end up having it to where they do the flying V, and they ultimately like go out there and they do their flying V, which ultimately, when looking at it, I of course enjoy that in the sequel movies where eventually they have the flying V and you have it to where the more skilled hockey players are just taking this silly move and realizing how silly it was, and it's just annihilating the Mighty Ducks. And I thought that was freaking hilarious. It's like, yeah, this isn't gonna work forever, there, buddy. Like all of that Pee Wee crap isn't gonna work here, kind of thing. And I thought that was hilarious. So going on, so we end up having it to where seemingly uh, that we end up having it to where Banks is trying to like make friends with this duck team, but he is also an outsider reasonably. We end up having it to where the Hawks are consistently like seeing like, hey Banks, I hate you. You're dead. So we end up having it to where Banks's father wants Banks to be on the Hawks, and so ultimately we eventually have it to where Banks is to have it to where Ducksworth is making a deal to where ultimately Banks could actually play hockey with the Hawks, and like that is that. And then eventually they can just do whatever the following year. So we end up having it to where Bombay ends up getting fired over basically him just humiliating his boss and ultimately just saying, no, like, I'm not going to resolve my dispute. I'm ultimately going to have Banks play on my team because it's the right team. And so we end up having it to where Bombay is quacking his boss out the door basically to be fired. So we end up having it to where and Emilio Estevez eventually takes his team out to a North Star game, and the North Star players are just like, hey Bombay, you're still looking pretty sweet, bro. You look like you could still have some sweet skills. How about you go and have a tryout with us? So ultimately Bombay's like, sure, I guess. And so at the very tail end of this movie, we have it to where Bombay is going off onto a bus to ultimately go and do tryouts, I guess, for the North Stars. Well, ultimately he's going into the minor leagues of hockey to make his way to the North Stars, I guess. So anyways, we have it to where within here we kind of just have Fulton, and like that's it as people that have real true hockey skills. Like it seems that like Charlie has like the triple deke thing that he does at the tail end of this movie, but a lot of it is just kind of bizarrish, kind of like they do the like the figure skating move where we have the girl like spin around, and then all of a sudden the girl, all of a sudden the like her brother ultimately tells her like, okay now, and then she stops spinning, and then he throws her the puck, and so she knocks it into the goal, and I'm like, this is the weirdest move ever. But also, so is the flying V, and everything that kind of goes on here is just a bizarrish move that doesn't seem to quite make sense. But it's just like it looks cool for a movie kind of thing, and that's all that it needs to be. So we have it within this final match. Because I gotta get out of here at some point soon. We ultimately have it to where the Hawks and the Ducks are fighting it out, duking it out, just brutally duking and fighting and hurting. So we end up having it to where seemingly one of the Hawks ends up taking Banks out, ending up ramming him into the goalpost or into the net, let's just say, and we end up having it to where seemingly, I'm assuming Banks gets some kind of concussion of sorts, and so he ends up getting taken out. And Jesse Hall is like, "I'm gonna get revenge on him," kind of thing. Like I'm gonna get my revenge kind of thing. But ultimately, really, Fulton really gets the real revenge out of all this thing, because we end up having it uh, to where I think the big jockey esh like guy, the big guy that ultimately is in on the Hawk team, ends up like uh, ends up going and like checking I think Connie, and so we end up having Fulton is like, dude, you're like, this is such a brutish guy. So you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go and I'm gonna fling him over the side of this railing and hope that he just hurts himself so he could be gone for the rest of the game. So we end up having it to our full and then it's going into the penalty box for 2 minutes for being a jerk. And we end up having it to where like Bombay is trying to like, dude, he didn't even touch him. He didn't do anything. So so we end up having it to where ultimately this match is like really, really close. We end up having it to a reasonably that the Hawks have a lead, but the Ducks are trying to make a comeback. So eventually we have it to where there's a penalty on to uh, like there's a penalty because the Hawks end up trying to pull some shady stuff to try to get Charlie to not score the goal. So we end up having it to where Charlie has to be the magical one to score this last goal for the team. And so ultimately we have it to where like like Bombay is giving his essence onto Charlie to just say like get my revenge, like seek my like God, what is the word? Um, like do my right my wrong kind of thing, like like kind of like yeah, like right his wrong. So we end up having it to where Charlie is going and doing his triple deke, his thing, and ultimately have it to where like it would have been actually really interesting if we would have had it to where Charlie ended up failing, and like it would have just ended the exact same way that Bombay would have lost in the very first movie. I thought that that would have been interesting because when looking at it, it would not have mattered if this team won or lost or not. Because when looking at it, you could have had it to where in the sequel they could have gotten even better and could have really cleaned house of beating this. this hockey team. And so I think like they could have done a sequel where in the sequel then they beat them. I think really the first part of this movie was just a morality tale of people saying like, "Hey, look how far we got." Like from basically being the worst team in hockey to ultimately bizarrely playing with footballs in a hockey rink where ultimately people are tossing footballs to one another. We end up having Bombay doing a game with them to ultimately just talking about communication. Um, we end up having also them going and learning how to do soft hands, ultimately tossing an egg to one another. And bizarrely, we have it through a lot of this movie where we kind of consistently have to have these like moments where people are consistently like throwing back at one another certain things, where ultimately when Bombay is kind of leaving off, we end up having some of the kids ended up saying some of the stuff that ultimately they had said to him, ultimately saying like, "Hey man, soft hands," and wax on, wax off, and all and all this kind of jazz. It's not the same movie, but anyways. Um, so yeah, we end up having it to where eventually we have it to where Charlie ends up winning for this team, and it seems like always Charlie is like the go to guy to resolve all of this, and so eventually we have it to where the team wins. The coach Riley is ultimately just like, well, I guess I got my comeuppance, and so ultimately he ends up leaving with his Hawk team, and so we end up having it to where everybody's huzzahing and yeah, we won. Because ultimately, and I thought the interesting thing was like we really have a real true like different dynamic where we have it to where Coach Riley's ultimately saying like, well, I want everybody to win, and I want like winning's the only thing that matters, and like ultimately he's like threatening to replace every single one of his team members with some other kids that ultimately he'll be able to find somewhere, which I'm sure he won't. So, and we also have it to where Bombay is on the opposite side, just saying like, "Hey kids, go out there and just have fun. Whatever the heck that you want to do, just go ahead and do it." Like, and plus, again, a lot of these things that are going on into the delivery of any of this hockey stuff is so weird and are so bizarre. Like, it kind of feels a lot of times that a lot of things are just out of place in this movie. I don't know why. There's just these hard connections that just don't quite make sense as far as just the line delivery or whatever for this entire movie. I don't know what it is. It could have been maybe the direction of this movie, or like I've seen other Emilio Estevez movies. Everything is just easy and like good approaches and stuff like that. Like I guess maybe like for a sports film, there is a bizarrish sports delivery that makes no sense to me. Um, I don't know. But when looking at it, so Charlie or Bombay ends up leaving to ultimately go onto the bus, but ultimately he comes back and ultimately tells, "Hey kids, make sure that you guys are practicing because we got a title to defend." And all the kids are like, "Yeah, boo." Hockey season's over, you schlub. So we end up having it to where Emilio goes off in the bus, and that is the tail end of this review. So I enjoy this movie. I think that this movie is fun. It's just the fact that there's some like bizarre line deliveries, and it kind of feels to me like there feels like these. It kind of feels very wooden for a lot of this movie. It kind of feels like there's definitely line deliveries, and it kind of feels like people are kind of out of their element through most of this film. Like I don't know what it is. It feels like everybody is just out of their element through this entire movie. It's very odd. It's very bizarre. But other than that, by and large, I just enjoy this movie for what it is because I just enjoy the Mighty Ducks whatsoever. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.